A 6-year-old girl whispered, "I'm not really sick." And what she revealed unraveled a shocking web of lies, betrayal, and $1 million scam, led by the very woman her grieving father trusted most. This isn't just a story about saving a child. It's about learning to listen before it's too late. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that grip your heart and leave you breathless. I remember the exact moment everything began to unravel. The hospital hallway hummed with the usual late-night rhythm, distant beeps, the quiet shuffling of nurse shoes, and the occasional muffled conversation. But when I stepped into room 212, the world narrowed to the small girl sitting upright in the hospital bed, watching me with eyes far older than 6 years. My daughter, Ellie. She looked so small in that oversized gown, her honey-brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her arms resting gently on the thin white sheet. Her chart, clipped to the foot of the bed, painted a bleak picture. Low-grade fevers, gastrointestinal symptoms, behavioral changes, all consistent with the aftermath of a severe viral infection. Dr. Baines had used words like escalation, early intervention, and pediatric transfer. Words that chilled me more than any winter breeze. But Ellie? She didn't look sick. Not tonight. "Hey, Pumpkin," I said gently, setting my briefcase down and pulling the chair closer to her bed. "How are you feeling?" She blinked at me, serious. "Daddy," she whispered, glancing toward the door as if someone might be listening. "I need to tell you something." I smiled, thinking it was another story about her plush bunny's secret adventures. "Sure, sweetheart. What's up?" But then her small hand reached out and tugged on my sleeve, tight. Her voice dropped lower, urgent and unshakably steady. "Rachel paid the nurse to lie." It took a second to register. "What?" "She gave Nurse Shelby money. I saw it," Ellie whispered, looking over her shoulder again. "She told her to say I had a fever when I didn't." The words didn't land all at once. They hit in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally the slow creeping chill of dread. Rachel, my girlfriend of 3 months, the woman who had appeared just after Sarah's funeral, warm, helpful, deeply understanding. The woman who had brought soup when Ellie refused to eat, stayed late during doctor consultations, even stepped in to help with medical paperwork when I was too emotionally drained to face it. She'd become essential. Or so I thought. I looked at my daughter, really looked. Her cheeks weren't flushed like they'd been described in the last report. Her skin wasn't clammy. She didn't look fatigued. In fact, she looked more alert than I'd seen her in weeks. "Ellie," I said slowly, "that's a very serious thing to say. Are you absolutely sure?" "I saw it," she interrupted. She gave her an envelope. And then Nurse Shelby came into the room and stuck that thermometer in my ear even though I said I felt fine. She didn't even wait for it to beep before writing something down. My throat tightened. Did you tell anyone else?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." I leaned back, my heart pounding. Rachel had coordinated Ellie's care from the start, claimed it was her way of giving back since she used to work in hospital communications. She had access to systems, knew the lingo, even used her connections to fast-track some of Ellie's appointments, and I'd been grateful. Too grateful. Too exhausted. Too blind. "Daddy," Ellie said softly, "I'm not sick. I don't feel sick. I want to go home." I reached for her chart again, pretending to skim it while trying to calm the sudden rising storm in my chest. Everything was there: temperature spikes, food refusal, lethargy, but none of it matched what I was seeing in front of me. Ellie sat up straighter, her voice bolder now. "I even drew a picture. I'll show you tomorrow. I drew what I saw." A child's drawing. It sounded silly, but coming from her, it was like a siren. She had never made up stories like this. She loved facts, figures, puzzles. When Sarah was sick, Ellie sat beside her bed and asked the doctors questions most adults would be afraid to ask. She never once lied, not even when she was scared. I nodded slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Okay," I said. "I believe you." And I meant it. Or at least, I wanted to believe her. But part of me still clung to the illusion that Rachel, kind, competent Rachel, couldn't possibly be capable of something so vile. I kissed Ellie's forehead. It felt cool. Not feverish. Not even warm. I stepped out of room 212 with a pleasant smile pasted on my face, nodding to the night nurse at the station. My feet carried me through the halls, but my mind was far away, playing back every conversation, every suggestion Rachel had made about Ellie's care. Her subtle encouragement to sign the power of attorney, her careful warnings about making the right medical choices before it's too late. Had I missed the signs? Or had I just been too broken from losing Sarah to see them? I stopped in the hallway, just outside the pediatric records room. I still had administrative clearance. Even more than that, I was the one who built the policy protocols for this floor after we expanded it 3 years ago. A minute later, I was in the digital log system, scrolling through Ellie's vitals. The latest fever had been logged at 12:37 a.m. I remembered tucking Ellie in around 9:30. She'd been warm, not hot, not enough to match the 102-degree fever written in Nurse Shelby's report. That nurse, I barely knew her. She wasn't part of the long-standing night staff. Rachel had vouched for her. Said she knew how to handle scared children. I stared at the screen. A wave of nausea rolled through me. If Ellie was telling the truth, and God help me, I believed she was, then someone had tampered with her records. Not once, repeatedly, which meant her condition wasn't a mistake. It was a manufactured diagnosis. And if Rachel was behind it, no, I couldn't jump to conclusions. I needed proof, real proof. But first, I had to look my daughter in the eye tomorrow and find that drawing. Because if I had learned one thing as a father, it was this. Children don't lie like adults do. They don't twist truths for money. They don't fake symptoms to manipulate. And when a 6-year-old girl who just lost her mother looks you in the eye and says, "I'm not really sick," you damn well better listen. Because the smallest voices often carry the biggest truths. And I had almost missed it. Almost. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital just after sunrise wearing the same wrinkled shirt from the night before. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the entire night pacing my living room, replaying Ellie's words over and over, staring at her medical logs on my laptop, flipping between disbelief and fury. If she was right, and God, something in my gut screamed she was, then I'd let a stranger infiltrate my home, my grief, and nearly get away with manipulating my daughter's care. When I stepped into room 212, Ellie was sitting up with her coloring book in her lap, swinging her legs, calm and cheerful like nothing had happened. She looked up, her whole face lighting up. "Daddy," I smiled, forcing my face to soften even as my heart pounded with urgency. "Morning, Bug," I said, settling beside her. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded. "I finished my drawing, the one I told you about." She flipped through the pages, flowers, butterflies, a lopsided unicorn, until she landed on a page that instantly froze my blood. It was her hospital room, drawn from above, like a child's version of a blueprint. Her bed, the monitor, the IV stand, the small table near the foot of the bed. 2 stick figures stood on one side, one labeled Rachel, the other Shelby. Between them, a rectangle that looked like an envelope was being passed from Rachel to the nurse. And in the bed, she'd drawn herself with one eye open, a speech bubble pointing toward Rachel's figure with the words, "Right, fever." My mouth went dry. I took the drawing in both hands and stared at it, stunned by the detail. The proportions were clumsy, sure, but the placement of everything was disturbingly accurate. Even the little notepad the nurses used was drawn in the corner. A 6-year-old had documented a crime better than some surveillance systems. "You saw them do this?" I asked softly. She nodded. "Serious now?" "2 nights ago. I couldn't sleep. They thought I was out." "What did Rachel say?" "She said she needed the nurse to say I was sicker, so you would sign something. She said you were stressed and this would help you make the right decision." I clenched my jaw. My stomach turned to stone. I thought about all the times Rachel had lingered by Ellie's bed, tucking her hair behind her ear, bringing juice, promising to help Daddy through the hard stuff. And underneath it all, she was orchestrating this. Ellie pointed to another part of the drawing. "See? That's me watching. I wanted to tell you right away, but she was here all day yesterday. You did the right thing, sweetheart." I looked at her, really looked. Bright eyes, healthy color, full of energy. "You feel okay today?" She nodded again. "I'm hungry." That was all I needed to hear. Ellie hadn't had an appetite in over a week, at least according to the nurse's logs. "Okay," I said. "I'll go ask Nurse Donna to bring you something." She beamed. "Can I have toast and the apple jelly?" "You got it." As I stood to leave, she tugged my sleeve one more time. You believe me now, right? I turned back, crouched beside her, and took her hand in mine. Yes, Ellie, I believe you, and I'm going to fix this. I walked straight out of the room and headed to the administrative wing, where the security office was tucked behind 3 doors and a buzzing keypad. James, the night shift guard, was still finishing his paperwork when I entered. Hey, Mr. Whitaker, everything all right? I need security footage, I said, all pretense gone. Room 212, past week, night shift. James blinked. All week? All of it. Between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., focus on hallway footage first, then I'll request inside footage if necessary. He nodded and started pulling up the files. I stood behind him, arms crossed tight, trying to manage my breathing. The first 2 nights, nothing. Just routine walks, nurses moving between rooms. But then, night 3. Timestamp, 11:47 p.m. There she was. Rachel. Entering the pediatric wing with no badge swipe. I stared at her on screen, wearing her signature navy coat, hair tied neatly, shoulders tight. She paused just outside 212, looked around, then knocked softly. A moment later, Nurse Shelby joined her. They spoke briefly. Rachel leaned in close. Shelby nodded. Their exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then Rachel turned and walked away, disappearing off screen. A few minutes later, at 12:15 a.m., Shelby reappeared with a digital thermometer and clipboard. She entered 212. I held my breath. Can you switch to the hallway monitor at 12:35? I asked. James clicked ahead. There she was again, Shelby, sitting at the nurse's terminal, typing steadily for over 10 minutes. The medical record logs I'd reviewed last night timestamped Ellie's 102 fever at exactly 12:37. I exhaled slowly. The whole thing was choreographed. Rachel had coached the nurse, and the nurse fabricated the record minutes after pretending to take Ellie's temperature. James, I said, my voice tight, can you download and save the last 4 nights of footage for me? Encrypt it and keep it confidential. He nodded, expression suddenly serious. You got it, sir. I walked out of the office with my mind spinning. The drawing was real. The lie was real. And I was standing in the middle of a conspiracy involving the woman I thought I could trust, the woman I had leaned on when I was too broken to stand. Now I understood her urgency around the power of attorney. The papers she kept hinting at. Just in case, she'd said. You never know when something might happen to you. Ellie needs someone who knows the system. She wasn't protecting us. She was positioning herself. And Ellie, she'd seen it all before I had. I passed the pediatric wing again on my way back to Ellie's room. As I neared, I saw Rachel standing at the end of the hall with a small bouquet of flowers and her usual warm smile. But this time, it looked different. Forced. Measured. Mark, she said brightly, walking toward me. I was just coming to check on Ellie. I heard she had a bit of a restless night. I stopped, blocking her path. She's sleeping now. Maybe let her rest. Her smile didn't flicker, but her eyes twitched just slightly. Of course. Just thought some color might cheer her up. I nodded toward the nurse's station. Why don't you give them to Donna? She can pass them along. She hesitated for just a breath, then smiled again. Sure, that works. I watched her walk away, bouquet trembling slightly in her hand. She was rattled. Not broken, but off balance. Good. Because I was just getting started. Later that afternoon, as the sky outside turned a hazy gray and rain began tapping against the windows, I sat alone in my office, staring at my reflection in the black monitor screen. My tie was loose, my hands were folded tightly together, and for the first time since Sarah died, I felt something worse than grief creeping into my chest. Helplessness. I had evidence. Ellie's drawing, the temperature logs that didn't match her condition, the footage of Rachel whispering in the hallway, but none of it would mean anything if I didn't act fast. Rachel was smart. She moved like someone playing a long game, never rushing, never making noise. If she realized I was catching on, she'd pull back, erase her trail, shift tactics. She wouldn't run. She'd outmaneuver. She was the kind of person who didn't get caught. She got ahead, and I'd let her get dangerously close to my daughter. I opened the secured personnel database and ran a quick background check on Nurse Shelby. Contracted only 6 weeks ago. Recommended through an agency Rachel used to work with during her time in hospital PR. That wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about this was. I had to know more. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled rank. I picked up the internal line and called over to the main surveillance office across the street, the one we typically used for higher-level compliance investigations. I hadn't used my override code in nearly a decade, but today I didn't hesitate. I need internal hallway footage from the pediatric wing, I told the on-duty tech. Room 212. Time frame, past 5 nights. Focus on motion-triggered events between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. There was a pause on the other end. Any particular reason, Mr. Whitaker? The man asked carefully. Internal audit, I said evenly. Confidential. An hour later, I was back in the small viewing room on sub-level 2, seated beside a younger tech named Rowan, who didn't ask many questions once he saw my badge. The lights were dim. The only sound was the soft mechanical hum of the footage loading. Here we go, Rowan said, tapping the keyboard. The first 2 nights passed without much activity, just routine nurse rounds. Then came night 3, and everything changed. Timestamp, 11:47 p.m. There she was, Rachel, walking calmly down the pediatric corridor, coat draped over one arm, her heels silent on the linoleum. She paused near room 212, looked around, and stepped into the shadowy alcove near the supply closet. Then Shelby entered frame from the opposite end, clipboard in hand. She didn't look surprised to see Rachel. In fact, she walked directly to her. They spoke for just under 30 seconds, Rachel leaning in close, hand gestures sharp and subtle. Rachel handed her something. It wasn't visible on the grainy feed, but it passed from one hand to the other. Envelope-sized, thick, discreet. Shelby tucked it into her pocket and walked away. I gripped the arm of my chair. Rowan glanced at me but said nothing. Jump ahead, I muttered. 12:15. He tapped the keyboard again. Now Shelby reappeared, pushing a cart with standard vitals gear. BP cuff, digital thermometer, blood oxygen meter. She moved quickly, glanced around once, and entered room 212. She was inside for less than 3 minutes. Can you pull up the hallway camera outside the nurse's station? I asked. At 12:35 a.m., Shelby appeared again. She approached the nurse's terminal, sat down, and began typing. The log files I'd reviewed from Ellie's chart noted a recorded fever of 102.1 at 12:37. That meant Shelby had recorded the value after pretending to take Ellie's temperature. Slow it down right here, I said. Rowan zoomed in slightly. The footage was still murky, but I could see the rhythm of her typing, focused, methodical. Not a nurse casually inputting routine vitals. This was someone crafting a narrative. She paused once, took something out of her pocket, a notepad, glanced at it, then kept typing. She's scripting it, I said aloud. She's literally creating a diagnosis. Rowan finally spoke. Should I flag this for internal security? Not yet. I straightened. Burn everything from the last 4 nights to encrypted drives. Lock them down and hand them to me directly. He nodded, already reaching for the USBs. As the files burned to disk, I stepped outside the room and stared at the wall. My pulse pounded behind my eyes. It wasn't just about Rachel anymore. It was about the hospital. My hospital. The place where Sarah had spent her final months. The place Ellie was supposed to be safe. And now it was being used as a stage for a lie. A calculated manipulation designed to extract money, power, and legal control over a 6-year-old girl. Rachel knew what she was doing. Every late-night whisper, every forged temperature, every nudge about signing that power of attorney, she'd been building toward something. And I'd almost handed it to her. I thought about all the times she sat beside me, hand on my shoulder, telling me that grief makes you second-guess your instincts. I had believed her. Hell, I had let her into my house, into Ellie's life. And the worst part? I needed her, or at least I thought I did. After Sarah died, Rachel had become this calming presence in the chaos, but calm can be a mask, and mine had just slipped. I took the USBs from Rowan and thanked him quietly. Then I walked out into the parking garage and sat in my car with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel, eyes shut. What did Rachel really want? The power of attorney? Control of Ellie's treatment? Or something worse? A memory surfaced. Rachel sitting on my porch one night, sipping wine, saying softly, "You're lucky, Mark. You still have Ellie. You can still make different choices." At the time, I thought it was sympathy. Now I wasn't so sure. I pulled out my phone and dialed Dr. Baines. "Mark?" He answered. "Everything okay? I need you to hold off on all decisions about Ellie's care. No adjustments, no transfers, no consultations, not without my direct approval." Of course, he said, sounding puzzled. May I ask why? I'm handling something sensitive, and I'll loop you in soon. I ended the call and leaned my head back. The raindrops hit the windshield like soft percussion, steady and relentless. Back inside the hospital, I passed by the pediatric wing again on my way back to Ellie. I saw Nurse Shelby this time, leaning over the terminal, typing away. I stopped a few feet behind her. Excuse me, Nurse Shelby, she startled slightly, turning toward me with a practiced smile. Mr. Whitaker, good afternoon. Ellie seems to be doing better today. What's your assessment? Oh, well, she said with a light laugh. She's been a bit up and down. Her temperature fluctuated again around 2 a.m., but nothing too alarming. Interesting. I'd seen the footage. She hadn't entered Ellie's room at all after midnight. I nodded slowly. Could you send me those updated logs? I'd like to review her full chart. She hesitated just a moment too long. Of course. I'll email them right away. I smiled, polite and firm. Thank you. I appreciate your attention. As I walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I knew what I was up against. And I was done playing nice. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house on and Ellie asleep upstairs, her drawing tucked safely in my briefcase. The house still smelled faintly of lavender from the bubble bath she'd insisted on. Her safe smell, she called it. I watched the steam rise from a mug of untouched tea, heart heavy with the reality I was slowly accepting. Rachel had nearly won. Not just my trust, she had woven herself into the very fabric of our grief. She'd cooked us dinner, cried with me, tucked Ellie in when I was too tired to pretend everything was fine. She'd positioned herself as our anchor, and I'd let her. Worse, I'd relied on her. But now I knew what the anchor was attached to. Money, control, and a document sitting inside my desk drawer. The medical power of attorney. For weeks, Rachel had been gently pressing me to sign it. It's just a precaution, she'd said sweetly. What if you get in a car accident or something happens during one of your business trips? You need someone who understands the system to make decisions if you're not available. It had sounded reasonable. Hell, it had sounded smart. I'd even gone so far as to fill out my name on the form. But I hadn't signed it, not yet. The next morning, I called the hospital legal office and instructed them to pull all existing power of attorney filings related to my daughter. I needed to be sure. No copies, no authorizations could exist without my name on them. I was assured there weren't any, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel wasn't finished. And that meant I couldn't wait for her to make her next move. That afternoon, Rachel showed up again at the hospital with that same serene smile. Dressed professionally in a soft blue blouse and blazer like she was preparing for a press conference. She brought fresh strawberries for Ellie and a crossword puzzle book for mental stimulation. I met her outside room 212. You just missed her, I said. She's with Dr. Baines for a routine checkup. Oh, that's fine, Rachel replied, handing me the strawberries. I'll just leave these with you then. She looked me over, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. Everything okay? You seem off. I smiled. Just tired. We stood there in silence for a moment. Her eyes didn't leave mine. You know, she said softly, you can't carry all of this alone. You shouldn't. I leaned against the wall. I'm managing. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. Mark, we've talked about this. If something happens to you, God forbid, Ellie will be caught in red tape. I know this system. You know that. You've seen what I can handle. Why are you hesitating? I stared at her, the calmness of her tone at war with the fury rising in my gut. Is this really about protecting Ellie? I asked. Or about controlling her? She blinked slowly. What kind of question is that? I didn't answer. I just opened the folder and looked at the familiar document, Power of Attorney for Medical Decisions. Her handwriting was at the top where she'd labeled the sections. All I had to do was sign, one signature, and she'd be legally empowered to move Ellie anywhere. Approve treatments, request medications, authorize transfers, even against my will if I was declared emotionally compromised. I handed the folder back. I need time. Rachel's jaw tensed. Time isn't a luxury when it comes to health. I nodded, and neither is trust. She didn't say another word, just smiled tightly and walked away, heels echoing down the corridor. I turned and entered Ellie's room. She was curled up on the bed, headphones over her ears, watching a cartoon on the tablet Nurse Donna had brought in. She looked peaceful, but I was anything but. I knew what was coming. Rachel wasn't going to wait much longer. She'd built the narrative. Ellie's symptoms, fabricated or exaggerated, were already in the record. Dr. Baines, though trustworthy, had started suggesting that Ellie might need a more specialized facility, one with 24-hour pediatric monitoring, advanced diagnostics, psychological support. Portland Children's. It was a world-class center. But it was also far enough away that oversight would be harder. I knew how these things worked. Once she got Ellie there and had the power of attorney in place, she could begin procedures that drained every penny from Ellie's trust fund, justified by treatment protocols. And the kicker? She'd already planted the seed of doubt in others, that I was still grieving, unstable, struggling to make decisions. She had subtly questioned me in front of nurses, taken charge during consults, redirected conversations. She was painting me as a liability. And if I didn't act, she'd get what she wanted. That evening, I went to the one place in the hospital no one ever looked for answers: the paper archives. Every digital system has gaps, but the old files, the daily printouts, the internal shift notes, the offhand scribbles nurses made during rounds, those were real, tangible. In the filing room, I pored over physical notes from Ellie's night shifts. Nurse Donna's last handwritten entry, 3 days ago, read, "Patient bright and responsive, no fever, restful sleep, appetite returned, request reassessment. Monitor recommended only if symptoms return." That was the last note from Donna. Everything after that was from Shelby, and they told a completely different story. Patient restless, 1 or 1.8 fever, no appetite, difficulty sleeping, recommend escalation. Overnight, Ellie had gone from stable to deteriorating, with no medical justification. I snapped a photo of both pages. Back in my office, I compiled everything: Ellie's drawing, the surveillance footage, the chart inconsistencies. A case was forming. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to raise alarms. Then came the final blow. A message popped into my inbox. Subject authorization reviewed, transfer preparation, patient E. Whitaker. Dear Mr. Whitaker, in preparation for possible transfer to Portland Children's Hospital, we request that you review and sign the attached documents. Medical recommendation pending final labs. Suggested timeline for transfer, 48 hours. Sincerely, Pediatric Administrative Office. I sat back stunned. The transfer had been initiated. She was trying to take Ellie. I picked up the phone, heart pounding. "Get me Nurse Donna," I told the desk. "Right now." 2 minutes later, Donna appeared at my door, her face lit with concern. "She's doing fine today," she said. "Actually asked for chicken nuggets at lunch." "I know," I said, "and I need your help." Her eyebrows lifted. "I think someone's trying to fabricate a medical crisis," I said, "and I think it's someone close to me." Donna didn't ask who. She just sat down, leaned forward, and said, "Tell me everything." And I did, because I wasn't just protecting my daughter anymore. I was preparing for war. It was close to midnight when I finally left the hospital. Rain had returned, falling in thin, steady sheets that turned the pavement silver under the parking lot lights. I sat in my car with the engine off, windshield wipers still ticking in rhythm, heart beating slower than it had all day. For a few moments, I just breathed. It was the first real quiet I'd had in weeks. That's when I noticed him. A man, maybe late 60s, standing under the covered walkway outside the long-term recovery wing. He was wrapped in a flannel robe and hospital slippers, his posture rigid despite the weather, a small digital camera in his hand. At first, I thought he was a confused patient. I opened my car door, stepped into the rain, and called out, "Sir, you all right?" He looked up, and I recognized the face. I'd seen him around the pediatric floor, a quiet, dignified man who always nodded politely when he passed. I never knew his name. He smiled faintly and said, "Mr. Whitaker? I was hoping I'd run into you." I blinked. "You were?" "Yes," he said, stepping forward, careful on the wet concrete. "I didn't want to go through channels. They're not always reliable when something urgent needs to be heard." I tilted my head. "What's this about?" He held up the camera. "My name's Frank Grady. I've been a patient here for a few weeks, recovery from abdominal surgery, and I think I might have something important concerning your daughter. In a different life, I might have brushed it off as nonsense, but not now, not after everything I'd seen." I opened the passenger door. "Get in." He climbed in slowly, settling into the seat with a grunt and closing the camera carefully between his hands. He looked at me for a moment, eyes sharp beneath wire-rimmed glasses. "Before I retired," he said, "I worked 35 years in private surveillance, mostly corporate insurance fraud and high-risk security assessments. Old habits don't die easy. I still keep my camera nearby, and I watch. A lot. Especially when sleep doesn't come easy." I said nothing. I just watched him. Waited. "I've seen your girlfriend, Rachel, visiting the pediatric floor. Not once or twice. Regularly. Always late. Always around the same time. But she never signs in. She doesn't wear a badge." My chest tightened. "She's always with the same nurse," Frank continued. "Blonde hair, tall, nervous eyes." "Shelby," I muttered. "Yes, I didn't think much of it at first, but then I overheard a phone call, 2 nights ago. Rachel was in the family lounge just outside my room. She didn't know I was there. She was talking about a transfer, about getting the authorization signed. And she said, I quote, 'Once the papers are in, we move fast. No questions, we'll keep it clean.'" He handed me the camera. "I didn't record that call," he said, "but I've been recording the hallway. I wanted you to have this, because something about it didn't sit right." I powered on the camera, thumbed through the files. The resolution was grainy, but the timestamps were clear. Rachel. Approaching the nurse's station at 11:43 p.m. 2 nights ago. She was carrying a manila envelope. Her expression was calm, but there was an intensity to her walk, like a woman with a plan already in motion. She leaned in close to Shelby, whispered. The nurse hesitated, looked around. Then, with a twitch of reluctance, she took the envelope and slid it into her coat. Another clip, timestamp, 12:15 a.m. Shelby entering Ellie's room with a small vitals kit. She was inside for 2 minutes. Then she returned to the terminal and began typing. Again, a pattern, deliberate, precise, and damning. "This has happened more than once," Frank said, quietly. "I've logged 5 nights of this routine. Every time she visits, that nurse follows, and afterward there's always a new log in your daughter's chart." I looked down at the camera in my hands like it was a loaded weapon. "You don't know what you've just given me," I said. Frank smiled gently. "I think I do." "But why?" I asked. "Why would she go through all this? What could she possibly gain?" Frank reached into his robe pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote down what I remembered from that phone call. It might explain a few things. I unfolded the note. The facility confirmed the 6-month protocol, covered by insurance. Estimated payout $800,000. If we stretch to a year, could hit 7 figures. Trust fund access clears once we have the emergency authorization. He'll feel too guilty to stop it. I couldn't breathe. Ellie's trust fund, the one Sarah had set up from her life insurance, the money meant for Ellie's future, her education, her care. Rachel hadn't just wanted control. She'd been planning to steal my daughter's life from under her. "All of this?" I whispered. "Just for money?" Frank nodded solemnly. "Money does strange things to people. But I don't think that's all. I think she truly believes she's helping, that you're too close to see what's best for your little girl." I looked out the windshield, rain streaking in diagonal lines. She said I wasn't thinking clearly. That grief made me a bad decision maker. She told Ellie I might not be able to take care of her. Frank placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Then you prove her wrong. You protect that girl like your life depends on it." I exhaled slow and long. "You know," Frank added, "when my granddaughter was sick, she told me once, grown-ups don't always listen when the truth is small. Your daughter's truth is small, but it's pure. You listened. That matters." I turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed. "You've done more for my family in 1 week than some of my own staff. I owe you." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise me you'll stop her, before it's too late." "I will," I said. He nodded once, pulled the collar of his robe tighter, and stepped out into the rain. I watched him disappear down the walkway, small and steady, like a man carrying the weight of someone else's war. Back inside the hospital, I marched straight into my office, locked the door, and placed the camera footage, Ellie's drawing, and Frank's written note into a secure file. Then I picked up the phone and called the police, because this was no longer a medical emergency. This was criminal. And it was time to bring everything Rachel had built crashing down around her. I arrived at the hospital the next morning before the sun had even risen, the sky still bruised with midnight blue. My hands were steady, but everything inside me felt wired, electric, like I was walking into a fire I hadn't quite learned how to put out yet. I'd spent the entire night preparing, duplicating files, forwarding footage to legal, alerting the hospital board of a pending internal investigation, and working with the police on how to proceed without tipping Rachel off too soon. We needed one more day to organize everything before making a move. One more day. But Rachel didn't wait. When I walked onto the pediatric floor, something was wrong. Too quiet. The nurse's station was unmanned, the usual morning shuffle strangely absent. The soft hum of machines, yes, but no clipped conversations, no footsteps echoing down the linoleum. And then I reached room 212. Empty. The bed was stripped. Ellie's stuffed rabbit was gone from the windowsill. Her coloring book was missing. My heart dropped. No, no. Not now. Not like this. A young nurse I didn't recognize stepped into view, tablet in hand. I intercepted her. "Excuse me, where's the patient from this room? Ellie Whitaker?" She checked the screen. "Transferred." "Transferred where?" I asked, every syllable sharp. "To Portland Children's Hospital," she said matter-of-factly. "It says here the transfer was completed at 6:03 a.m. I stared at her. "By whose authority?" She scrolled. "Medical power of attorney filed yesterday evening, authorized by Rachel Loring." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. My throat dried instantly. "That's not possible," I said. "I never signed it." She frowned. "It's in the file, time-stamped and uploaded." You are Mr. Whitaker, right?" But I was already moving, running, really, down the hall toward security. I barged into the security control room without knocking. James, the overnight supervisor, stood up when he saw my face. "She took Ellie," I said. "They forged my signature. She's gone." James' expression paled. "What? No, sir, there was a guard posted outside her room." "Then where the hell was he this morning?" He looked at the log. "According to this, the guard received a call around 4 a.m. Said you requested him to redirect to ER security coverage." "I never made that call." I growled. James looked horrified. "The voice, he said it was you. He knew the clearance code." I backed away from the desk, my hands curling into fists. Rachel had thought of everything. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. "Where is she?" Rachel's voice was calm. Too calm. "She's safe, Mark. She's where she needs to be." "You forged my name," I said. "You stole my daughter. That's kidnapping." "I did what was necessary," she said, still sounding disturbingly serene. "You were paralyzed. You couldn't act. I had to. Ellie was getting worse." "She's not sick," I snapped. "You made her sick. You lied. You bribed nurses. You falsified medical records." A pause. "You're still thinking this is about fraud," she said quietly. "It's not. This is about you failing your wife, about you failing Ellie, and about someone finally stepping in to do what you couldn't." The line went silent for a beat, then her voice dropped lower, colder. "Sarah died because you hesitated. You wouldn't approve the experimental therapy. You didn't listen to her doctors. I read the files. I saw it all." I froze, blood draining from my face. "I was there," she continued. "I was already working at the hospital when Sarah was dying. I saw what happened. I watched you fall apart. I watched you stand at her bedside every night, waiting for someone else to save her. And no one did. Sarah's cancer was terminal," I said through clenched teeth. "We did everything we could. You convinced yourself of that," she hissed. "But you've been lying to yourself ever since." I heard her exhale, a long breath like she was trying to calm herself. "I couldn't save Sarah," she said softly. "But I can save Ellie. I won't let you mess it up again." "Where are you?" I demanded. "She's at a private care facility," Rachel replied. "Somewhere peaceful, somewhere she can heal. They specialize in cases like hers. Complicated family dynamics, emotional trauma, misdiagnosed symptoms. She doesn't need any of that," I shouted. "She needs to come home." "She needs to be away from you," Rachel snapped. "From your grief, from your guilt, from your inability to act." I paused. "Let me talk to her." "That's not a good idea." "Let me talk to her." There was silence. Then the line went dead. I stood frozen for a moment, phone clenched in my hand before snapping back into motion. I called the lead detective on the case, relayed everything. Then I called Frank Grady. He answered on the first ring. "She took her," I said. "Used the forged paperwork, had her moved to a private facility." He was quiet, then said, "I think I know where." I blinked. "What?" "She mentioned a name once. I remember it because it sounded like a retreat center. not a hospital. Riverside Wellness, outside the city, about 40 minutes. I jotted it down after hearing her on the phone, just in case. 10 minutes later, we had confirmation. Riverside Wellness Center, a private pediatric psychiatric facility, high security, limited parental access. Rachel had checked in a 6-year-old girl under emergency psychiatric authorization, claiming she was experiencing delusions, particularly involving her father. They were already preparing a long-term care plan. I had to get there. With 2 police detectives and a court order in hand, I drove like hell through the rain-soaked highways, heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. I imagined Ellie in a strange room, confused, scared, asking for me, while someone tried to convince her that her memories were broken, her truth invalid. I wasn't going to let her drown in the lie Rachel had built. When we arrived at Riverside, the front staff were immediately flustered. Within minutes, we were ushered to a small, private room. One of the administrators, a tall, thin man named Dr. O. Richardson, met us with a clipboard and wide, apologetic eyes. I don't understand, he said. Miss Loring provided signed authority. Everything appeared legitimate. She forged it. One of the detectives said, You've been holding a child without proper legal consent. Dr. Richardson paled. She's in an evaluation room with Miss Loring. She insisted on sitting in. I was already moving, down the hallway, past the white walls and soundproof doors, until I saw her through the small glass window in the door. Ellie, sitting in a chair, clutching her rabbit, eyes wide and blinking fast. Rachel sat across from her, clipboard in hand. And when did you first start imagining that your daddy was in danger? She asked in a syrupy voice. I pushed the door open. Ellie looked up. Her face lit up so fast it nearly broke me. Daddy! She jumped to her feet, running. But Rachel caught her by the arm, gently, firmly. Ellie, sweetheart, she said in that awful sing-song tone. Remember what we said. Sometimes when you're very upset, your brain shows you things that aren't really. I'm real, I said, stepping into the room. Ellie, I'm here, and I'm taking you home. She let out a sob and ran into my arms. I held her so tight, I thought I might break. Rachel stared at us, jaw trembling, eyes wild. You don't understand, she whispered. She needed saving. She needed me. But the detective was already behind her, cuffs out. You're under arrest, he said, for fraud, kidnapping, and child endangerment. And as they led her away, I whispered into my daughter's hair. You were right, baby. You were right about everything. And I would never, never doubt her again. Ellie wouldn't let go of my hand the entire drive home. She sat curled in the back seat, buckled in tight with her stuffed rabbit held against her chest, and her little fingers laced through mine from behind my elbow. Her grip was firm, like she thought that if she let go, I might disappear. I didn't blame her. For a child, the betrayal she'd just lived through wasn't something you shook off after a nap and some cartoons. She'd been gaslit, lied to, and almost ripped from her home forever. And she had never stopped telling the truth. I told them, she whispered as we passed the halfway mark on the highway, I told them I wasn't sick. I looked at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, but her eyes, God, those eyes still held fire. I know you did, baby, and I believed you. I'm so sorry it took me too long. She was quiet for a while. Then she said you didn't love me enough to keep me safe. I nearly pulled the car over just from the weight of those words. I gripped the steering wheel, steadying my breath. That's not true. That's the biggest lie of all. She nodded slowly. I didn't believe her, but it still made me scared. My voice caught. Me too. We got home just as the clouds parted, revealing a strip of afternoon sun that painted the living room in soft gold. Ellie ran straight for the window seat she used to nap on when Sarah was still alive, curling up in the cushions like a cat finding its favorite spot again. I stood in the entryway for a long time, just watching her. Alive, safe, whole, and mine. But I knew the storm wasn't over. Not yet. That evening, I sat with 2 detectives in the hospital's internal legal team, reviewing everything. The forged documents, the surveillance footage. Rachel's arrest was only the beginning. Nurse Shelby had also been detained. Her confession was quick, shaking, tearful, full of apologies, but ultimately damning. She admitted to taking money in exchange for altering logs and recording fake symptoms. She claimed she didn't know the full extent of Rachel's plan, only that she was helping a scared mother figure out the right path. But Rachel wasn't Ellie's mother. She was a woman who couldn't face her own grief, so she built a fantasy where she could rewrite the past, using my daughter as the stand-in for the child she'd never had, the second chance she believed she deserved. She was broken, but she was also dangerous. That night, I found Ellie asleep in Sarah's old rocking chair, her rabbit cradled in her arms. I picked her up gently, carried her to bed, and tucked the blankets around her. She stirred just once, looked up at me with sleepy eyes and whispered, "No more doctors, right?" "No more," I promised. The next morning I woke up to the sound of a spoon clinking in a cereal bowl. Ellie was in the kitchen, eating Fruit Loops and drawing. I smiled, leaned against the doorway, and watched her for a minute before I said, "What you working on?" She held it up proudly. It was a sketch of a garden, full of yellow flowers. "Mommy's daffodils," she said. "Remember, she said they're brave flowers. They come out when it's still cold." I felt something crack and mend in the same breath. "Yeah, I remember. We should plant some," she said, "in her spot, the one behind the hospital where she used to read." The memory came flooding back. Sarah sitting on that stone bench, Ellie in her lap, pointing at butterflies. She loved that spot, quiet, untouched. "I think that's a perfect idea," I said. 2 days later, Ellie and I were at the hospital again. Not as patients, not as a grieving family, but as something new. Survivors. We brought gloves, spades, and a small crate of daffodil bulbs. I knelt in the soil while Ellie mapped it out like a tiny architect, instructing me where each flower should go. "That one goes near the rock. This one in the sunniest corner," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Mommy would want them to be brave." We worked side by side in silence for a while, until she looked up and said, "Why did Rachel think lying could help people?" I paused mid-dig, set the trowel down. "She was hurt," I said. "Really hurt. And sometimes when people are that sad, they try to control everything. They think if they can make all the decisions, nothing bad will happen." "But bad things happen anyway," Ellie said, like she was reading my thoughts. I nodded. "Yes, they do. But lying doesn't stop that. It just makes everything more confusing." She seemed satisfied with that answer. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a small wooden sign she'd painted herself. The letters were a little crooked, but it was beautiful in that raw, innocent way that only a child's handwriting can be. Sarah's Garden, a place for truth and courage. We planted it in the center of the flowers. Ellie held it steady while I pushed it into the soil. And for the first time in months, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt like peace. Later that week, the hospital board met to discuss several policy changes. I brought Ellie with me. She sat quietly beside me during the meeting, drawing in her notebook until I stood up and cleared my throat. "I'd like to propose something," I said, glancing at her, then at the room full of executives. "A new set of standards for how we listen to children. Because if my daughter hadn't spoken up, we wouldn't have caught what was happening until it was too late." Murmurs around the room, raised eyebrows. Ellie stood up, her small voice carrying more weight than any memo ever could. "I made rules," she said, pulling out a paper and handing it to me. I read them aloud. 1. Kids should be listened to, especially when grown-ups don't want to hear it. 2. If a kid says something is wrong, 2 grown-ups have to listen. 3. Kids can ask about their care and get real answers. 4. No one should ever say, "You're too little to know." 5. If a kid is scared, they can ask for someone they trust to help them talk. It was met with a long silence. Then the chief of pediatrics said, "I think we should print that on the wall of every pediatric ward." Everyone nodded. And just like that, the children's truth rules were born. That night, back at home, Ellie climbed into my lap on the couch, tucked her head under my chin, and said, "Daddy?" "Yeah, bug?" "When I grow up, I think I want to be the hospital's lie detector." I laughed. Real, full-throated joy, the kind I hadn't felt in months. "You know what? I think they're gonna need one." She grinned. "I'll practice until then." And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. We'd been tested, lied to, nearly torn apart. But Ellie had spoken the truth, even when no one wanted to hear it. And the truth, as it turned out, was braver than any lie. 3 weeks passed. The garden behind the hospital bloomed with the first golden heads of daffodils breaking through the thawed earth. Ellie called them Mommy's soldiers because they were the first to rise when winter wasn't quite finished. She visited them after school twice a week, carefully inspecting each bulb, like a field commander counting her troops. There was something different about her now. Stronger. Quieter in the best way, like she knew things she couldn't yet explain but didn't need to. Her confidence hadn't grown louder, it had grown deeper. Like roots. And I was learning how to breathe again. The fallout from Rachel's arrest had been swift. With the camera footage, witness testimony, and the forged documents, her indictment was inevitable. But what shocked everyone was her plea in court. She didn't deny it. Not once. She stood there, calm and expressionless, and said, "I was trying to stop another little girl from being buried." They diagnosed her with a complex grief disorder, severe enough to impair her judgment. Her sentence would involve years of monitored psychiatric care. I didn't rejoice at that outcome. Honestly, I pitied her. Somewhere deep inside, Rachel had been trying to rewrite a story she never got closure on. The problem was, she nearly rewrote ours in the process. Nurse Shelby lost her license. Dr. Baines requested a transfer to a rural branch hospital, citing ethical fatigue. He had been a good man, misled and manipulated. I didn't press for his resignation. Some things are punishment enough. But the most surprising change came from Frank Grady. He stopped being a patient and became a volunteer. He started spending time with the pediatric patients, helping them build paper cameras, teaching them how to watch the world quietly. Ellie adored him. She called him Mr. Frank the Spy, and he accepted the nickname like a badge of honor. One afternoon, as we sat on a bench near the garden, Ellie handed him a folded paper. "You helped save me," she said, "so I made you something." He opened it carefully. Inside was a child's drawing, Frank standing in the hallway with his camera, and a speech bubble that read, "I see everything." He chuckled, then his voice softened. "Most people don't notice the quiet ones. But I always have." Then he looked at me. "You've got a brave one, Mark." "I know," I said. "She taught me how to be brave too." That weekend, Ellie asked to return to the garden with a new sign she'd painted. The first one, "Sarah's Garden, a place for truth and courage," was still there, but she wanted to add another. This one was smaller, less official looking, but even more heartfelt. It read, "I told the truth, and my daddy heard me." We planted it just beneath the daffodils. The wind moved gently through the leaves, as if nodding in approval. That evening, as I tucked Ellie into bed, she looked up and asked, "Do you think Mommy would be proud of me?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. "More than proud," I whispered. "She'd be in awe." Ellie smiled sleepily. I was scared, but I remembered what she said. What did she say? That even when people don't believe you right away, the truth doesn't go away. It waits. I kissed her forehead. "That sounds exactly like something your mom would say." And in that quiet moment, I knew Sarah was still here, in Ellie's courage, in her clarity, in the truth that had survived a storm of lies. The hospital board officially adopted the Children's Truth Rules that month. They printed the 5 rules in colorful lettering and posted them in every pediatric room, beside the call buttons and teddy bear posters. Nurses were retrained. A new advocate role was created, someone assigned to every child admitted, whose sole job was to listen. Not diagnose, not treat, just listen. And every time I passed room 212, now assigned to a different patient, I paused and remembered that not so long ago, a 6-year-old girl had pulled her father out of a fog with nothing but crayons, courage, and one quiet sentence: "I'm not really sick." Months later, Ellie and I were walking through the city park when she stopped beside a tree and looked up at me. "Daddy," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. If I ever get scared again." "Like really scared? What if no one believes me next time?" I crouched down beside her. "Then you do exactly what you did before. You tell the truth. Loud, soft, in drawings and whispers, whatever way you can. And I promise you, someone will hear you, even if it's just me." She nodded slowly, like she was storing that promise in her heart. Then, out of nowhere, she grinned. "Also, I've decided." "Decided what?" "When I grow up, I don't want to be the hospital's lie detector anymore." "No? What changed?" "I want to be a superhero instead, but not the flying kind." "Oh yeah? What kind?" "The kind that listens." I felt my throat tighten again as I pulled her into a hug. "That sounds like the most powerful kind." She hugged me back fiercely. "Because the quiet stuff, that's where the truth hides. Later that night, I stood on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops, the air turning cool and sweet. In my pocket, I still carried the folded piece of paper Ellie had given me months ago. Her original drawing, the one with Rachel and the nurse and the little speech bubble that had started it all. It was wrinkled now, the colors faded a bit. But I kept it with me. Not just as evidence, not just as a memory, but as proof that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. And that the real job of a parent isn't to always know the answers. It's to know when to stop everything and listen. Especially when the world tells you it's nothing. Especially when it comes from the mouth of a child. Because the truth always waits. And it deserves to be heard. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If you've made it this far, it means you believe, like I do, that sometimes the smallest voices hold the biggest truths. This wasn't just a story about deception or justice. It was a story about listening, about learning to pause, to trust, and to truly hear the people we love, especially our children. Because when we dismiss their voices, we risk losing something more precious than we know. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're watching from. What part of the world do you call home? Let's build a space where honesty is honored and courage is celebrated. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like this one to life. Stories that remind us of the strength found in love, truth, and family. Don't forget to leave a comment below. What did this story teach you, and have you ever learned something important from a child? Until next time, keep listening. The truth is always there, waiting.